Hello, friends. Welcome to a very bright Saturday morning. I don't have office today. It has been quite some time that we had connected for a book review. The last we did was Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I had put up a review of that book also, so you can check that out. It's available in my channel. Now, this is the second book by Arthur C. Clarke that I'm reading. The first one, no, this is probably the third one. First one was Rendezvous with Rama. Again, something that I read in 2021 or early 2022, I guess. But I didn't put up any video of that. I mean, there are lots of changes that has happened since then in my life. So, I mean, a lot of videos I have not put up. Now, coming back to the story that I have in my hands here, right? It was a teaser of a series of the same name that I randomly came across on YouTube. So what I'm doing right now is watching a movie is too much time consuming, right? So I just go through the summaries and plots of the movies that are available in various channels. So within, let's say, 15-20 minutes, you get the entire story of the movie, and so you don't have to waste much time there. Just look at the comfort that we humans seek whenever we get the opportunity. Someone would have spent millions or even billions in making a movie, and I mean, appreciation is on one side. We don't even want to give the time to watch the movie and giving its proper due, right? Anyway, so watching movie reviews is a much time efficient way of getting to cover more and more movies. So there was a series on sci-fi. It's also mentioned on the book, right? It was a mini series where the novel's adaptation was covered. That also you can watch. I watched a review and it was good. Anyway, coming back to the plot, right? So this book, again, what I feel is something that has inspired a lot of later sci-fi writers. I would go to the extent to say that Cixin Liu, in his Three Body series also, there would be correlation and similarities that you will find. I mean, it's a completely genuine piece of work, but just like I said right now, nothing is completely ingenuine, and no idea, as far as I know, no idea can be completely independent, right? So the story starts with two cosmonauts who are on their way for a Mars mission. And by the way, the book was written back in 1954, and by that time it was only Yuri Gagarin that had been to space. The space race was on full flow by between the United States and the Soviet Union. The book, at some point of time, in the preface itself, it says that one future US vice president is making a claim in 2001. He was reiterating Kennedy's claim that America would beat the Soviet Union to moon. So that had not had happened yet, right? So anyway, coming back to the plot. So these two cosmonauts are on their way to the launch pad, and just as they were about to board the rocket, what they see, and all the others who had gathered around to see the launch, that there are these huge ships that have come and covered the entire sky. I mean, it was the first time that both these astronauts, in their words, they felt the real fear of God. And they also got to know that humans are not alone. So that's where the book starts from, right? The context with the first two pages has been set about the kind of roller coaster ride that this book will be. Now, Arthur C. Clarke not only was a hard sci-fi writer, he was also a great philosopher. That's what I would ascertain. So even in the first two pages, At one side, he was depicting something hard sci-fi that is happening all around. On the other side, he's also trying to pull the various social and political angles that were prevalent at that point of time. So they were also comparing the launch of the first space mission by the Soviet Union, where Yuri went to space, and then this new cosmonaut was just sitting at Yuri's grave, and then she was thinking about how the times have changed. While when Yuri went, it was completely a secret affair of the Soviet Union. Currently, all the countries of the world have come together, whether by need or by social change, to make global missions to the space. So everyone is contributing. Anyway, coming back to the plot. So that was a day when humans came to know that they were not alone in the universe, and that is when the new era of human civilization starts. So the book is divided into 3 chapters. First is the Earth and the Overlords. Second is the Golden Age, and third is the Last Generation. So the span of the book is somewhere around 100 years. So that's the entire span of time during which all the events would have taken place. Now, in the prologue, we got to know that there were alien ships that have just come up and covered the skies of Earth, right? So all the big cities in across the world were covered by these huge-sized spaceships that had made everything that had humans made, right? All these rockets to go into space. These seemed like paper boats in front of those huge alien ships. So the ships hovered around the cities for like 5 years, and then there was an announcement that came from the ships in English. So, I mean, the way it was depicted was that they spent these 5 years, these aliens wanted to understand and learn the nitty-gritties of life on Earth, and when they were sure of having known a lot about the Earth, they connected with the representatives of the Earth. So the overlords, the name that was given to them by by Earthlings only. So they didn't call them overlords. It was the Earthlings that had given them the name. They chose only one alien from amongst them. His name was Carolyn. So Carolyn was the representative of the overlords who would do all sorts of conversations, again with one representative from Earth, which was the Secretary General of the United Nations. Ricky Storm Green, that was his name. Again, these characters were sort of introduced in the new chapters, but then it's a book that has taken, 100 years to complete, right? So there were different characters that would get introduced from time to time. You would get connected to them, and then they would be left off suddenly. It's not a natural flow of events that happens in regular novels, right? So Carolyn and Storm Green, they were the ones who would be the bridge between the two civilizations. So Carolyn made an announcement through the Secretary General that Earth, these were long conversations that you will get to know when you read the book, right? I'll just try to summarize, trying to get the gist out of whatever would have taken place between them. So amongst one of the demands of these overlords, so I would call them demands, but though there was nothing, what word do I use? Nothing, no animosity that was ever expressed by these aliens. They were just too grand to consider anything humans would be capable of, right? So the first announcement was that all the global conflicts, all the issues between nations, all these conflicts had to go, right? And over time, that is what has actually happened. There were a few examples that had come up to Carolyn where some country or the other, or some community or the other, would not follow Carolyn's directive. Carolyn didn't use the regular modes of threatening them to come into line. So in one instance, what he did was he covered the entire space over a country with some sort of covering that blocked entire sunlight to these people, right? So without having had to spill a single blood, I mean the country had to come to ground. Without sun, I mean, you just think about the repercussions, right? It would not seem a very significant hindrance, but if you think deeper, you would know that a country would be dead if that happens. Anyway, so these were the kind of interventions that Carolyn would take from the behalf of the overlords. So so they were so powerful that there is nothing that the humans could even think of that could have contested them. So that is something that they had reiterated subtly through their conversations, although there has never been any instance where they were rude or disrespectful or anything of that sort towards the humans. So, as a return benefit, the overlords started removing all sorts of pain, suffering, all conflicts, any sort of issues that were prevalent in the earth that could have been settled if the humans wanted, those were settled. Right? Everything became much more peaceful. People had enough to eat, enough places to roam around. There were no borders. Everything was done in a collaborative way. So all these things were happening. The earth was becoming a better place to stay. Right? So this is how the story progressed till now. Everything was well and good. There was no evil intent that was being shown by these super powerful aliens. And Earth was also quite happy to a large extent, right? Everything that the primary objectives of Carolyn being removal of all pain and suffering, that was sort of gone. So they basically became sort of gods, right? But then any conscious civilization by virtue of it is always curious. So humans by virtue are very curious, right? It seemed like a very hard sell that how can something be completely altruistic. And the overlords never expressed what their end goals were, why they had come, why they were helping Earth in such a way, and they didn't even show themselves. So it has been years since they have been present on the Earth, and even at this point, humans literally didn't have any clue about what the overlords actually were, and neither had they seen a single overlord till time. I mean, Carolyn was the only person that who would interact with the humans again through the UN Secretary General, and even he had not seen Carolyn. So, right. So all these doubts also started cropping up in some sections of the human society. So there was one such league that had come up, which was Freedom League, and it was led by a person called Wainwright. Now the Freedom League again would raise these kind of questions, and although the UN Secretary General or all the same people also had the same questions, uh, Wainwright started a cult called the Freedom League, which would leave no stones unturned to get to the detail. I mean, to get to know what the overlords really were, right? So at one instance, Wainwright, and it was not Wainwright, I think it was some extreme faction of the Freedom League, kidnapped the Secretary General and took him to a hideout and started questioning him to get to know more about the overlords, right? They basically asked the first question why the Secretary General himself was never even interested to know what the overlords were and what they looked like. I mean, why did this basic question not even come to his mind? The questions were valid, right? But then for the greater good, nothing was being done. And because the overlords are so much powerful, it basically didn't mean anything could be done to get an answer out of the overlords, right? If they were not willing to speak, then they will not speak. There's nothing that can be done about it. So while he was kidnapped, he was being questioned about starting from the basics of whatever his interactions with the overlords were like. I mean, what kind of place was it where this conversation would take place between the Secretary General and Caroline from time to time. So he said that he would be taken up in a spaceship, in the spaceship, to a small shuttle, and there would be a room in which was having a mirror-like wall in between, and then he would talk to Caroline by sitting in one side of this mirror, and he would get to know about, he would be able to hear Caroline from the other side of the mirror. Now, with some critical thinking, the people from this extreme faction of Freedom League, they deciphered that this sheet of mirror was nothing but a one-way mirror, and if a good enough light was being thrown at the mirror, whatever was present at the back side of the mirror could be seen, right? So that was the hypothesis that they came up with. It was at that point or sometime later that finally Caroline showed up. I mean, when the Secretary General till this point was extremely confused why Caroline has not been able to locate him yet, or why he has not been able to come up for rescue yet. So at this point, Caroline showed up. He neutralized, I mean, he didn't kill, by the way. Neutralized as in he, we remember that game, right? What was that game? Where we would call other folks, anyway, he just froze the moment for the other folks, and then he took the Secretary General and then started off. Now, as the Secretary General and Caroline were having the next conversation, the Secretary General came to know that Caroline had basically used. I mean, had become good friends by that time and they trusted each other. But Caroline had literally used the Secretary General as a pawn to get to know more about the Freedom League. And Storm Green, he felt a pinch of trust being broken. He didn't expect Caroline would be doing such thing. So that was one sort of trigger. I mean, I would say trigger because it's something that Storm Green would do was something that he would not have done if this trigger point was not there. The second trigger point was basically something that had come from inside of the Secretary General's consciousness. I mean, he had never asked or even wanted to know what Caroline actually looked like, right? So from the conversation with this extreme faction, he by the way, such a pleasant weather today. It has started to rain. Anyway, so one trigger point was that he felt a little bit breach of trust when Caroline, he found out, had used him as a pawn to get to know more about the Freedom League, right? And what this and their actual intentions or how harmful they can be. Caroline literally laughed away. I mean, that didn't mean a lot to him. I mean, he was not at all scared of whatever these faction was capable of. Storm Green. Wow, the rain. Again, so that was one thing that was the trigger point. The second was his own curiosity had been arisen because of that conversation, and he also felt intrigued to see. So he literally asked the question straight away to Caroline that this is something that had come from the Freedom League. Caroline also got to know about this, and Caroline informed him that the message has been conveyed to his seniors, by the way, that this is something that was brewing up on Earth and what is to be done, and he was awaiting their response, right? And the next time they met, Caroline informed Storm Green that he has got an update from his seniors that they would show themselves in the next 50 years. So again, a very interesting play of events, right? So on the one hand, he was ascertaining that they were agreeing to the extreme factions demands that they will be showing themselves in the next 50 years. At the same time, they were also buying time for whatever sort of mischiefs or plans they would have had in their minds, right? But the answer actually shocked Storm Green to some extent, because he knew that by the time the 50 years would have come, he would have not been there on Earth. So the third trigger point of his curiosity was also raised. He also knew that whatever he tried, Carolyn would very easily be able to find that out, and he didn't want to risk any sort of relationship between the Earth and the Overlords. At an overall level, Earth had become a much more pleasant place, right? So he literally asked the Overlord, what if someone tried to steal his identity or tried to, let's say, figure out or get to know what Carolyn would actually look like. Carolyn literally said that humans would not be able to do this. When Stormgreen pressed further, he said only if something led to a nuclear weapon being used to reveal their identity is when he would take an affirmative step. So that's what he thought about the humans. I mean, literally, there was nothing possible that the humans could do to know something that the overlords didn't want them to know, right? So, Tom Green also got his green signal that what he intended to do to know his identity was nothing close to a nuclear bomb being used to destroy the barrier between him and the overlord. So what he did was he took out a torchlight from his pocket, and then he shone the light against the mirrored wall, and he was able to see the overlord. And what's the next thing that he did? Nothing. So that's where his character ends. He actually took it to the grave with him, and he never revealed the secret of what the overlords look like. So the second part of the book is where things get even more interesting, and the human cultural and civilizational traits became even more expressive. So one of the reasons that Carolyn gave why they were not revealing themselves to human was that humans were not ready for them yet. This was explored with the starting few pages of the second chapter. Now the 50 years, as was committed by Carolyn, had come to an end, and it was time for the overlords to reveal themselves. So one of their ships landed in some city, I think it was New York or one of the major cities. And the first thing that Carolyn actually asked the humans to do was to send a little girl and a little boy towards his ship, right? And by the time, over this period of 50 years, the human society has changed a lot. I mean, people became much more free. There were no pain and suffering at all in the world. And since there were no pain and suffering, and there no need even to compete to achieve things that others don't have, so also these sorts of competition, everything had almost come to an end. And because that is something that had happened, one of the core aspects of human civilization, which is religion, also sort of came to an end. So religion as an aggregator of ideas, or an aggregator and a place where people would go to ease their pain, to wish for more, was no longer needed in the society. And that is when overlords decided to reveal themselves. That is something that they had calculated 50 years back. So their measurements were all precision driven. So Carolyn asked for one little boy and one little girl to come up to his ship's dial, and that is the moment when he revealed himself carrying the two kids on his two arms. So, just to visualize, he had two horns, he was red, he had black wings, he had hooves on his feet, and I don't know, I mean, maybe just like, if I can add, he might also have had a tail. He had glowing eyes. So, what comes to your mind when you think of a thing like this? He was 12 feet tall, fire in his eyes. So, he was the literal representation of the devil. A devil holding two little child lovingly in his arms and reaching out to the whole lot of humans that had gathered around to receive him. But because of this 50 years had been used to condition human beings, there was, I would not say there was not at all any sort of fear or any sort of confusion amongst humans on what had happened. But yeah, it was not what had it would have been if he would have revealed himself like 50 years back. And the Freedom League, by the way, was almost non-existent at this point of time. It was only some individuals having deeper ideas that would mean that would actually carry some conflicting thoughts. Otherwise, humans had become more or less homogeneously aligned with whatever the overlords were doing. And what it also meant was the death of real science and technology, the death of fundamental research. I mean, just let's pick up space research for an example, right? Till the time the overlords came, humans, by whatever technological advancements they were doing, they seemed like big advancements. They were making progress, right? They went to the sky, they would be going to the moon, they would be going to the Mars, and within 100 years, uh, as far as Arthur C. Clarke had predicted, people would be even civilizing on one of the planets on the solar system, having a permanent base, right? So all this didn't happen. Why? When you see these humongous spaceships right away on the clouds in front of you, what would you even want to do with your puny rockets? Right? They were no match even to a shuttle that these huge spaceships would be having. So advancement in tech sort of became dead. Consider medicines also, right? The overlords were able to relieve the earth of all its sufferings, all its diseases. So why would even humans have to invest anything, or what would that even mean if they want to, let's say, discover a new drug when the cure was already there? Not only the cure, when humans would not even fall into that disease, right? So every sort of progress went to an end, and humanity is something that had reached, the earth is something that has reached utopia. But that doesn't mean the death of human intellect and human consciousness, right? So there were few amongst humans, and even at that point of time, who would have their individual thoughts. And these were the artists and the literary geniuses. So one amongst them was the second character that we were introduced in the second part. So second character as well as the third, fourth, I mean a few more important characters would be introduced in this section. So the first one was George Gregson. Yeah. So George Gregson was he was a theaterist. I'm not sure whether he would direct movies or he would play in as an actor, but he was something related to art and culture, right? And he had come to a party organized by someone called Rupert Boyce, who again was a flamboyant aristocrat, and he was also serving as one of the agents of the overlords. I mean, he was overseeing some wild animals or something like that shit, right? So he had thrown a party. It was at this party that George Gregson and Jean, who was his girlfriend at that point of time, came, right? They were invited. And there were two things that were happening at this party that would be of some significance in the story, right? Rupert Boyce had recently married for the third time, and he was throwing this party just, I think, as a welcome to her. Her brother, whose name was Jan Rodriguez, who was again a South African and a astronomer, to be astronomer, right? So astronomy as a science had literally died at that point of time. he was also there. And Rupert Boyce, he also had a huge collection of parapsychic study, over 20,000 books or something. That's what he quoted, that he had collected, and he had a library of the same. So there was also an overlord. So there are more overlords that had been introduced by this point of time, named Rashaverak, who was studying these books on paraphysics, supernatural, whatever culture, religion, whatever was there in Rupert Boyce's library, and he would read like so many books in one go, right? So that was one condition that Rupert Boyce had put up to the overlords. The overlords, by the way, were amicable. They were not malevolent, right? They were seemed to be benevolent, and they. So what he said was, if someone wanted to study these books, they would have to come to his place. So Rashavera would come and then sit there in his study and study for hours, right? George and Jane saw Rashavera there, and even though, I mean, religion had been forgotten, people had forgotten, the devil was actually like not exactly forgotten, but then even at this point of time also, something in the appearance of the Rashavara did, of the overlord, did threaten the humans. So the subconscious level, at subconscious level, humans still know what, how the natural reaction should have been, right? So anyway, he was studying at the same time. Jan Rodriguez, an astronomer, brother-in-law of Rupert, was also there, and he was also someone who was not very happy with how things have happened, mainly because he wanted to explore the stars, right? And the stars had come to them. So something that had interested him since, I mean, ages. This is something that he could never be able to do, right? So he was not that happy. So George and to Jean, they got introduced to all the other folks, and later in the night, they started playing a card game. I mean, I would not get into details of what that game was. It's basically a paranormal game. That's what Rupert said. I mean, Rupert was someone who was a collector of these kind of things, right? And the way the game progressed was, I mean, somebody inside the room would actually become a mediator of knowledge or mediator of communication that otherwise people in the room would have not known. So information is always there. Just all the information that exists in the universe, right, is already available in every nook and corner of this universe. It's just that a medium is needed to get that information out, is something that is needed, right? They started playing this, and over the period in which the game was played, slowly and slowly, George and Jan and even Rashvarak, they started to realize that some real answers were actually coming up. They didn't believe, or they didn't even know the Rashvarak, again, I would exclude from this group because we literally know nothing about the overlord still now. But the other two guys, George and Jan, were actually surprised to find that there was some sort of truth in the answers that were coming out. So while they were concluding the final question, that Jan actually stood up and asked, quite unexpectedly, because he didn't believe in the game. He didn't even participate in the game to start off with, right? He asked, what is the home of the overlord? And the answer that came out was some NGS, some sort of 6 or 8 digit numbers. Although it seemed like a jargon to the other folks, Rashvarak and Jan, they got the point, and they got to know that this is something. This is the location of a planet out there in the stars. And Jan would not want to commit to the fact that this is something that had come purely out of supernatural reasons, but he somehow believed that this is the star that the overlord should have come from, right? Rashvarak was watching everything very closely, and right away after the information was revealed, Jean actually felt unconscious and she fell down on the ground. Sometime after this incident, George actually also fell in love with Jean at this point of time. Though they had been coupled for quite some time. I mean, marriage and other social obligations became much more different 50 years down the line, right? So this was the time when George actually also proposed Jean to marry him, and she also readily accepted. Now Rashwadak, who was also in at the same period, also noticed how Jan asked that question and the answer that Jan had got, right. And when he went back to his spaceship, he did inform Carolyn of the development and that they needed to keep an eye on Jan. So now after that incident, Jan again, uh, he went back to South Africa. Now he also knew that there would be some sort of observation that would be done on him, basically from whatever had happened that night. He wanted to pursue his interest further. Now he cannot directly go to the research, right? And Carolyn would have come to know, and for any unforeseen debacle might have come across his way. I mean, that would have stopped him to getting to know any further, right? So he did lots of secretive research. I mean, he went, in one instance, he went to London on a study tour for some thesis, and then he went out to some observatory there, and then he got some confirmation on the aliens' home world. So he was plotting in his mind on what can be the way to get to know more about that planet. So at some point he realized, or he found out, that there was someone named Professor Sullivan who was in charge of sending stuffed casts of different animals and life forms off the earth and sending them over overlord ships to the overlord's home world. Right. So he approached Sullivan, and there was a lot of story that happened in between him and Sullivan, where he was able to finally convince Sullivan to take the risk and send him to the home world of the aliens along with one of these stuffed animals. So he also wrote a letter to before, I mean, he got into one of these stuffed animal, which was, by the way, a whale. So he literally went inside a whale when he took that trip. I mean, he was not having any idea of what the trip could have been, whether he could have survived. The star he knew, I mean, by that point of time was around 40 light years away. So even if he would have reached that planet, it would have been like over 80 years by the time he would have come back to Earth. So anyone he would have known at this point of time would have been literally dead at that point, right? Whereas on the other hand, because of this time travel, he would have aged only like a couple of months. So he had all these things in mind. He did write a long letter to his sister, who was Rupert's wife, of why he had taken up this step, why this was the only thing that was possible on his hands that he could do to fulfill the ever Christian dream that he had, right? He couldn't, there was no other option left for him. You also know the practicalities. I will not get into the details. He also knew that the overlords would have pretty easily found out once they would have dig deeper, or maybe they even know at this point of time and they just don't care, right? So he, I mean, left a letter for his sister with Sullivan and asked him to send it to her only after the ship had been dispatched. And that is how the dispatch happens. So he lives in that ship. So that is how Jan left for the Overlord's planet. The Overlord did come to know about this fact, and they conducted a meeting where they announced, I mean, they didn't actually like it a lot that Jan had actually left, someone from the Earth had actually left for their planet. They tried to explain to humans that humans were much younger in their knowledge base or technological base. He showed them images of nebulas where even stars were getting engulfed, and all sorts of grander level things happening in the universe. And he also showed humans the mirror, that they were not even able to handle things like nuclear weapons properly. They would have destroyed themselves. At the same time, he also told humans that at this point humans were not ready to handle any of this kind of shit. When time comes, they could at max maybe go reach out for the other planets, maybe 50 planets, but the stars are not yet for them. So post making this statement, Carolyn also, when it was shown that he had some hindsight, I mean, while he was just looking at the humans from his spaceship and then just thinking himself that what a good age it has been for the humans till now, and that good age was finally coming to an end. So this is how the second part of the book comes to an end, and the third part starts now. And the third part, the name of which is The Last Generation, we were again introduced to George and Jean Gregsons, right? And they had two children by this point of time. It was also described that at this point of time, some of the intellectual folks, the writers, the artists, etc., who felt that, I mean, they really wanted to, I mean, art and culture along with science was also dead, right? There was no pain and suffering or happiness, right? So what would art actually mean to these kind of people, right? But then there were some who would lament the things of the past and to cherish the same. They created a new city in an island in somewhere in the South Pacific, which they named as New Athens. And this is where George also moved to. Again, he was a theater artist, right? And he had two kids by this point of time. So there again, people were using rudimentary modes of communication like cycles. They were not using vehicles, etc. So one evening, George's elder son, who was Jeffrey, he was on a cycling trip to a nearby island when a tsunami hit, and he was supposed to die, but for some unforeseen reasons he survived. When he was asked in detail about how he survived, he mentioned of someone saying something in his ears that had helped him escape, something that even pushed a mountain from in front of him so that he can go up to a higher ground and then save himself, right? From that instant, it also happened that the boy Jeffrey, he also started having these different dreams about the various places he would visit, and these dreams were not something that would go away. I mean, anyway, any dream cannot completely go away, right? If you just wake up 10 minutes after dreaming and you tried hard enough, at least you would be able to remember some parts of it, but you would be able to recall everything about the dreams. What George and Jean also noticed was the younger kid who was, I think, what was her name? Janet or something like that. Yeah. Again, she also started showing some extraordinary powers. So she was able to move things telepathically, right? So she would be having maybe a toy or a container around her, and if she is annoyed, she was able to throw things around. George and Jean noticed these things and they kept quiet. The overlords also were noticing these things and they were waiting for George actually to finally come up and have a discussion about this. There were some long to and fro stories how this discussion finally happened, but the discussion between George and the overlords finally happened. So up until this time, the overlords, Carol and Rushvarak, they were fairly acceptable of whatever was happening in New Athens. I mean, they didn't deem it in any way affecting. I mean, it seemed that it would not be affecting them in any way. So it was allowed to progress as per its will. They never interfered in any of the activities of New Athens, right? So one day, Rashvarak came down to this island and then started discussing on various topics. The island started showing them the various things that have been done, like its new theaters, its science centers, etc. And Rashvarak or Carolyn, whoever it was, they were appreciative of whatever things that had been maintained, sustained, or even given a rebirth at New Athens. Post the visit, the inspector, I mean, let's just name him. He had a name. The inspector came back and updated Carolyn and Rashverak of whatever his findings were. Rashverak and Carolyn had a detailed, deep discussion about the dreams that Jeffrey was having, right? So he showed, they were able to track even the smallest detail about whatever dreams Jeffrey was having. So, some planet with some fiery landscapes, that was something that had come up in his dream, and they were able to name him as Fenandrian, or what were the names? Some Dion sort of names. Right, all these planets and stars, they could identify Rashverak and Carolyn from the dreams of Jeffrey. And there were many places that even the overlords were not capable of knowing. They had not been to even those places. So these were the kind of things that Jeffrey was seeing in his dreams. There was also one instance where in one of this dream, Jeffrey saw it was not Jeffrey was seeing things, these were being interpreted by Carolyn and Rashverak. So there was a completely flat world. It was located right in the center of a galaxy, and because of the strong gravitational pull of whatever quasars, black holes, supermassive black hole, etc. present at the center of the galaxy, the world was literally turned completely flat. So all the flat earthers around, there is hope for you. I can't guarantee the scientific details, but given enough gravitational pull, you can see the earth, right? It's flattened at the poles and elongated. It's an oval shaped body, right? So if the gravitational pull is strong enough, what is the limit of that difference between the polar longitude and the equatorial distance, right? This can very well change. With infinite gravity, this can maybe become completely flat, and maybe there can be organisms that are living in that planet who are completely flat, and for them the additional dimension of depth would something that would be completely unknown. They would be the real flat earthers. So these kind of worlds Jeffrey was visiting in his dreams, and the overlords were also able to see, and they were also even wondering whether these 2D creatures did have any consciousness. No one could say. So that's how things were progressing. At this moment, what also happened was George finally reached out to Carolyn, and again everything Carolyn was aware of. George was also taken a bit aback that although the overlords had announced that they were not spying on humans, they did have the capabilities of knowing things about humans if they wanted to. So over this discussion is when Carolyn finally informed George about the true intentions of what the overlords actually came for. So the overlords explained that they were merely a mediator for an even higher being called the Overmind. It was the Overmind's will that they were performing. They literally didn't have any clue of Overmind's actual plans were. They didn't have any visibility. They were too inferior compared to the Overmind. Parallelly, Jan was also already received at the Overlord's world, and he was also being shown around the different aspects of that world. So some of these conversations I think I mixed up somewhere, but the overall gist I am trying to just give it front of you. These are just of whatever was conspiring between George and Carolyn, and on the other hand Jan and the other overlords in the overlord's world, right? So one part of it was the overlords were not the masters of the universe like the humans thought. They were just tiny pawns who didn't have any idea of what they were actually doing. The overlords themselves, the next question actually that came from the humans were, why humans were chosen by these overminds, right? Why was the overlords not being chosen by this overmind? So the overlord, he explained that humans were not in its final stage of evolution. Overlords were already in their final stages, and there is nothing that they would further evolve into. So for them, their future in the universe was already sealed with the level of advancement that they have already achieved. But humans were only at an intermediary stage, and the overmind would send the overlords to such civilization which were at the transition phase between one state of evolution to the next grand stage of evolution. So in a way, the humans were inferior to the overlords, but at the same time, with this leap, they would change into something that would be maybe far superior than the overlords, or maybe anything that the overlords would never be able to come to know of. So in a way, humans were lucky and at the same time unlucky. The overlords, they were the masters of the universe. At the same time, they were just servants who didn't have a future, and they could only be jealous of what the humans actually can become in future, right? So all these grand revelations were happening all around. And Carolyn also informed George at this point of time that his kids were only the first ones who were experiencing this slowly. Each and every child, I think 10 to 14 years was the age that was considered, would be converted into something similar, which would not be human, which would be connected to the overmind. They would literally not remain humans. So, and George and as well as the other people around the world started noticing children would just go out, just stand out on the streets with their eyes closed, looking and staring up. They all seem to be controlled or connected to each other by some hidden cord that the humans would never know. George and Jean, they tried to hold their children as close to them for as much of time as possible, but finally their children also went away. This was supposed to be the last generation of human in its current form. So this is where the story finally reached. There are still some plot points that are yet to come. So Jan, on the other hand, was on this overlord's world. Most of the things that he saw there were completely blew his mind away. I mean, he could not even comprehend what he was looking at. Just to give an example, there were no streets there, right, on that planet. It was all red. It was a perfect replica of what hell would be considered back in the human days of religion. It was all fiery red, lava here and there. The houses were up on branches. The overlords, because they had their wings and the gravity of the overlord planet was much lower than that of Earth, they could fly from one place to the other. It was a completely different place altogether. He also saw a mountain at a distance which was evolving some lava up into the space. By the way, he had carried a photo camera with him to click photographs of whatever he saw, so that when he comes back to Earth, he can at least keep some reminders, or maybe he could show to the humans what all he had seen. He was the only person who had come out of Earth and been to the overlord world, right? So that was no less of a feat. So he tried to click a picture of, he had clicked pictures of the other stuff around, maybe. But when he was trying to click the picture of that mountain, one of the overlord came and stopped him. And it was implicitly told to him that that is what the overmind is, and they are not allowed to take picture. For the first time, he also saw that the overlords in such a state that they had someone who is so superior, and he also felt that the overlords in themselves also feel what the humans would be feeling because of the overlords presence on Earth, right? So after that, I mean, I think he spent around 2 months, and it was at that point that finally, I mean, I don't know whether he decided or the overlord decided, he came back to Earth again. 40 years. It was 40 years by the time he reached Earth, right? He landed on Earth, Carolyn was also there with him, he found a completely different picture of the earth. So gone were the cities, gone was the modern amenities, cars, everything was just lying as it is. I mean, he was the. Soon he realized he was the last man on earth. It was not very long back that humans had been wiped off. I would not say wiped off because the overlord didn't do any sort of killing or anything with the humans, right? So the humans, as soon as they came to know that there was no future, there was no kids, there was no future generation of human that would be left in the planet, a lot sort of wars, etc. started, and I mean the civilization fell into the tatters. When he landed, he saw everything was in ruins. Then he went to a city where, I mean, there was a human society like maybe roughly 10 years back, so a lot of things were afresh. So he started living in one of the villas with all sorts of luxury. Then he also noticed that at one side of the horizon, I mean, when he just, I think he opened a window and then noticed a similar sort of mountain that he had seen on the Overlord's planet. A mountain which was shooting something into the skies. And he could also see a girl from somewhere in a distance. That girl was basically, I think, George's younger daughter, Janet, I think. It maybe he assumed it, or maybe he saw something for real. But this mountain was there that was throwing something into the universe. It was at that point that Carolyn mentioned to him that it's far too risky to stay in the earth at this point, and he can carry along with the overlords wherever they went. He could have his life extended as much as he wanted. And since he is the last human, it would also make sense for him to continue a life that had once existed on earth. Jan also noticed that the overlords at their levels also wanted the best to understand how the overmind worked, what his actual intent was. So apart from the rudimentary things that the overminds had tasked the overlords to do, they had prepared lots of setups to try to gather more knowledge about the overmind, but no knowledge was good enough for them to know at all, anything at all. So Jan, I mean, he could have left Earth with the overlords, but he didn't. He told the overlord to let him stay at one of the sites that the overlords had made, and he said that he will keep on transmitting the last visuals or last experiences, whatever he sees on the earth, back to the overlord. And Carolyn and the rest of the overlord ships, everything left. At some point, he told him all these things that he was seeing, right? This mountain that was throwing something up into the skies. He also mentioned Janet, and then he also mentioned how matter or whatever from the earth was being extracted and then again thrown out into the space through this mountain. So these were the last, I think, words from Jan's end. Next we move directly into the overlord's ship, from where they notice that the earth gets burned in a jiffy and all the energy, etc., whatever existed in the world also escapes the earth. Right? So all these children, along with children, they're not the children anymore, so they had become some further beings compared to what humans were, and they took the last remnants of earth's energy along with them to wherever they went. And the overlord's journey continued to find the next search world, which was on the verge of this change from the existing phase to the next phase in evolution. The end was so dark. I mean, at every point you would appreciate the thoughts that would have been coming into Arthur C. Clarke's mind while he was writing this, right? This was one of the darkest endings that you could have ever thought of. I mean, in how many novels or stories would you find such a gloomy end? Given that the alien that had actually visited the earth was benevolent, they were not doing anything to harm the human civilization at all. So it's amongst the very few books, not exactly the very few books, it's turning out to be the majority of the books that I'm reading that are having such grand endings. So that's how it went. And I will close my video soon. Wonderful. And this is the naughty elder elder toddler that I have right now, who is equally interested in tearing the book apart. So that's how it ends. I already have my next book lined up. So I just received it now from Amazon. That's Olaf Stapledon Star Maker. Again, I hope it turns out to be an equally interesting read. And if that is the case, you will definitely see me in the next book review for Star Maker.